A father was hunting a deer with his son. The boy's name is Chris Kyle. At this time, his father was teaching him to hunt using a sniper rifle. At his first hunt, Chris aimed at a deer and he was able to shoot on target. Seeing Chris' shooting skills, his father felt proud and said that one day Chris would become a skillful sniper. The next day, Chris was having lunch with his family. Here, the father encouraged Chris to become a capable man to protect the weak. In the following days, Chris always helps the weak. In fact, he didn't hesitate to beat up anyone who dares to bully his friends. 20 years later, Chris grew up as a young man. He only lived alone because his parents had died several years ago. When Chris returned home, he saw the news on TV, reporting that the American ambassador in Iraq had now been suddenly attacked by a group of terrorists. This incident caused 80 Americans to be killed, and hundreds of local residents were seriously injured. Seeing this, Chris suddenly remembered the words of his late father, who once said that he had to protect the weak. The next day, Chris went to the Armed Forces Career Center to enlist himself as a Special Forces military. Chris did all this because he was very ambitious to protect Americans in Iraq, including local residents who often became victims. The American military needed additional soldiers, so Chris was accepted, but he had to undergo several training sessions before being sent to the battlefield. The next day, Chris and several soldiers were starting to undergo training. From early morning until late at night, they continued to train. A few months later, Chris took part in shooting practice. In this training, whose shot is on target, then they would be listed as a sniper for the American Special Forces. When it was Chris' turn to shoot, none of his shots were on target. This made Chris reprimanded by the trainer. Then Chris turned the scope of his rifle and aimed at a snake. With just one shot, Chris was able to shoot the snake. Here, Chris told the trainer that he was more skilled at shooting moving targets. Seeing this, the trainer felt amazed, and finally Chris was chosen to become an American Special Forces sniper. That evening, Chris and the others went to a bar to celebrate their success because now they were officially becoming American Special Forces. Not long after that, Chris met a woman named Anna, who also happened to be hanging out at the bar. After getting to know each other and chatting for a long time, it seemed that Chris and Anna fell in love at first sight. A few weeks later, Chris and Anna were getting closer, and they intended to go on to a serious relationship. Long story short, a few months later, Chris and Anna were getting married. When they were having fun partying, suddenly Chris got an order from his superior to carry out his first mission to go to Iraq. Like it or not, Chris had to obey his superior's orders. Anna looked upset because they had just gotten married, but Chris had to go on duty. Chris convinced Anna that he would be away for a few weeks. Shortly, Chris and his troops went to Iraq to carry out their first mission. On the way, Chris got information that their mission was to massacre the Iraqi terrorists who previously attacked the American Embassy office. When they got there, Chris and one of his colleagues immediately went to the top of the building to target the terrorists from a distance, while the rest of the troops would attack them from close range. Here, Chris' friend told him that the terrorist group also had a very skilled sniper named Mustafa. It was said that Mustafa had killed more than 100 American soldiers from a very long shooting range. Hearing this, Chris promised that he would finish off Mustafa with a shooting distance that was farther than Mustafa usually did. Chris suddenly saw a woman who was with her son. Chris aimed at the woman because he saw the woman's suspicious movements. Chris' suspicion was true because the woman carried a grenade and asked her son to throw it at Chris' troops who were looking for terrorists. When the kid died, the woman continued to throw the grenade, and Chris immediately finished her off. Not long after that, a car drove towards Chris' troops to detonate the bomb, but with his skill, Chris quickly shot the driver before he detonated the bomb. Chris also managed to kill one of the terrorists who was planting mines. On the other side, Mustafa, the sniper, was aiming at American soldiers. Mustafa managed to kill one of the American Special Forces members. After that incident, Chris and his troops decided to return to their headquarters to reorganize their strategy. At the camp, Chris and the troops were given instructions by the commander regarding their next mission. The commander explained that their main target was to catch the leader of a terrorist group named Zarqawi. However, the commander did not yet know where Zarqawi was, so he ordered Chris and the troops to go through every resident's house to look for information about Zarqawi's whereabouts. The next day, Chris and other soldiers started going through everyone's house to ask where Zarqawi was. When Chris entered one of the residents' houses, the owner of the house was very scared. Chris and his troops tried to calm him down and then said that they were just looking for Zarqawi. Then the man said that he didn't know where Zarqawi was. But he explained that there was Zarqawi's right-hand man, who was very cruel, named Amr, and he lived in the house at the very end of this area. Hearing this, Chris and his troops immediately set out to catch Amr. On the way, Chris was called by his wife, Anna. She gave the news that she was pregnant. Of course, Chris looked so happy because soon he would become a father. But suddenly, there was an attack from Amr's men who already knew that Chris was about to arrest Amr. In the middle of the war, Amr was coming to the man's house, killing him and his son. Then, Amr told all the people not to talk to the American troops if they didn't want to die like this man. Seeing this, Chris was about to shoot Amr from a distance, but unfortunately, Chris' action was thwarted by Mustafa, the enemy's sniper. After that, Amr and his men left, while Chris and his troops returned to their camp. Their mission was considered a failure because Chris and the others had not been able to catch Zarqawi and Amr. The next day, Chris' troops were sent back to America, while the other special forces continued the mission. Arriving in America, Chris was immediately greeted by Anna. They went home, letting go of the longing. Several months later, Anna gave birth, and Chris had now officially become a father. A few weeks later, Chris was assigned by the commander to return to Iraq. Anna, who found out about this news, forbade Chris and asked him to just retire from the military. Anna was afraid that Chris would die on the battlefield, and she didn't want to lose her husband. However, Chris promised Anna that he would definitely come back home, and after carrying out this mission, he would retire. In the end, Anna was forced to allow Chris to go. On the way, the commander said that the special forces who continued Chris' mission were massacred and none left. Therefore, the commander called Chris and his troops again because until now, neither Zarqawi nor Amr had been caught. Arriving there, Chris immediately held a meeting to set the strategy. Here, Chris said that their mission was to catch Amr first. After Amr was caught, they would easily find out where Zarqawi was. Shortly, Chris and the troops started their mission to catch Amr by going through everyone's house. In one of the houses, Chris asked a husband and wife about Amr's whereabouts. They swore that they didn't know where Amr was. Then the man invited Chris and his squad to have dinner together because he happened to have cooked a lot. But when they all started eating, Chris accidentally saw a wound on the man's elbow. Chris became suspicious, so he asked permission to go to the toilet. Turns out Chris didn't go to the toilet, but instead went to a bedroom to search the room. In the end, Chris managed to find a pile of weapons, which means that the man was part of the terrorists. Chris immediately interrogated the man and then threatened to kill his wife if he didn't tell Amr's whereabouts. In the end, the man was forced to tell where Amr was, and he would be a bait to lure Amr out. The man walked to one of the houses and was followed by Chris' troops secretly. Meanwhile, Chris went up to the roof of the house because he was going to attack with his sniper rifle. The man knocked on the door, and it was opened by one of Amr's men. At the same time, Chris immediately shot the person and also the man who tried to fight back. After that, Chris' troops started to enter Amr's house, and a battle broke out. After fighting for quite a long time, in the end, Chris and his troops managed to kill Amr and his men. Chris felt like he had failed because he should have brought Amr alive. Chris then returned to the base to tell the commander about this mission. The next day, Chris and the troops were assigned to hunt down Zarqawi, the terrorist leader. On the way, 2 spies contacted Mustafa and told him that American troops were heading to the eastern region. Hearing this, Mustafa immediately ordered his gang to get ready. Soon after that, they attacked Chris and his troops. In this battle, one of Chris' colleagues was shot in the face. Then Chris and the others decided to return to headquarters to save their colleague. When they arrived at the headquarters, Chris' friend was immediately treated by the medical team, while Chris and other troops decided to return to the battlefield. Arriving there, Chris' troops immediately attacked the terrorists. Some of Chris' comrades had to die because they were outnumbered. Chris was forced to give up and go back to the base because he didn't want more victims. A few days later, Chris saw a terrorist trying to shoot an RPG weapon towards their headquarters. Chris quickly aimed at the person, so he managed to finish him off. After the person was killed, there was a little boy who took the RPG and pointed it towards Chris' place. Chris was determined to aim at the boy, but he didn't dare to shoot him because Chris didn't want to kill a kid for the second time. Luckily, the boy didn't shoot the RPG and just left. The next day, Chris and his troops were seen meeting with the commander. The commander has just received information about Zarqawi, who has now fled to India. Therefore, their duty was only to hunt down Mustafa, the sniper, and his men who were still around. The commander also knew where Mustafa's group was hiding, so Chris and his troops could surround them this afternoon. So, without waiting long, Chris and other troops immediately moved to the crime scene to hunt down Mustafa. When they got there, Chris and one of his friends went upstairs to the top of the building to target Mustafa from a distance, while the rest of his troops would attack Mustafa's headquarters. It turned out that Mustafa was also preparing to welcome Chris and his troops, and he shot one of the members of the American Special Forces. Here, Chris realized that the shot must have come from Mustafa, so he immediately aimed his gun to find where Mustafa was. In the end, Chris managed to find Mustafa's location, but the distance was very far. It was 1907 meters. Chris' friend said that the distance was very far, and it was impossible for Chris to shoot on target, but with full confidence, he could fire his shot. Chris finally managed to finish off Mustafa with just one shot, even though it was from a very long distance. But another problem arose because Mustafa's men knew Chris' location, so they immediately surrounded Chris and his troops. Fortunately, the central headquarters immediately sent help by firing missiles at the terrorist group. The missile explosion caused a thick smoke, so Chris and the others took the opportunity to run away. In the end, they managed to board the aid car, even though Chris had to be shot in the leg. A few days later, Chris and his troops were returned to America because their mission was deemed successful. Chris was also named as America's best sniper for shooting Mustafa from a very far distance, which was very impossible. A few months later, Chris was reunited with his family, and now he had retired from the military because he once promised Anna. Not long after that, Chris had a guest, his former colleague Eddie. Here, Eddie invited Chris to play at the shooting range. Chris agreed, then he asked Anna for permission to go for a while with Eddie. When Chris was about to leave, Anna paid attention to Eddie because he looked quite strange. At the end of the film, it showed a convoy of police cars escorting the hearse. It turned out to be Chris, who had been shot dead by his own colleague Eddie. It was revealed that Eddie was suffering from post-war trauma, so that when he held a gun, he would shoot anyone who was nearby. All Americans looked very sad when they heard of Chris' death. Now Chris is remembered as an American hero who has succeeded in eradicating terrorists from Iraq. As for Eddie, he has been sentenced to life imprisonment.